Hello everybody and welcome to the Carlum Cymru revision sessions. The session this evening will focus on History AS level and will be presented by Andrew Morrell from Llanidloes High School. The session will last around 45 minutes where Andrew will run through the relevant content. If you have any questions during the sessions, please use the question and answer Q&A section and we'll do our best to answer your questions. You will see there's a hyperlink in the Q&A section. If you're happy to leave your name and email address, we would love to keep in touch with you so that we can send you information about future events. You can click on the link at any time during the session. Today's session will be recorded and the recording and any relevant resources will be uploaded to the e-sgol website under the Carlum Cymru tab. Thank you. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second History AS level accelerated session. Last week, if you were here, you will know that we looked at the story of Italy. As Karen said, the video and resources are on the Carlum Cymru website if you missed that. And tonight, then, what we're going to do is we're going to review a good Italy essay. So this is specifically for Unit 1, Option 8. Although, to be fair, what makes a good essay, whether it's Option 8, Option 2 or Option 4 or whatever, makes a good essay in Unit 1 across the board. So whatever option you're doing, actually looking and listening tonight will definitely help you with your essays across there. There's obviously 2 more Wednesdays following this, both of which will be led by Karen and focusing on Unit 2. So don't hesitate to come along to those as well. So what we're going to stop at first, before we actually have a look at this essay, is we're going to stop at the mark scheme, right? What the examiners mark the essay based on. And what they do is they initially look at the band, and then they give you a mark after deciding what band it's in. So to many people, we look at this and we think these are really complicated words. We don't quite understand. What do they mean by this? You know, analysis and evaluation, judgment, knowledge, communication. What do they mean by this? Well, I'm going to try and break it down a little bit. Before then, we look at it in the example of an actual essay that someone has written in the exam, and we'll go through feedback and base it on the mark that it was actually given in an actual exam as well. So if we look at analysis and evaluation, one of the key things that are needed in an essay, we can see that they say the learner is able to effectively analyse and evaluate the key issues in relation to the set question. Now, I should have said, sorry, this is what it looks like for a top mark question. Hopefully, you know, essays are marked out 30. So you can see here on the left, it's band 6, between 26 and 30 marks. So this is, you know, what an outstanding essay would look like. You know, 30 out of 30 would be outstanding if you ever got this. So analysis and evaluation, as I say, the learner is able to effectively analyse and evaluate the key issue in relation to the set question. So what does this mean in reality? Well, it means firstly that you look at each factor from more than one angle. It also means you make a clear and evidence and objective statements against the question. So you're evaluating against a question and you're being fairly objective. Many people think, you know, evaluation judgment is quite similar. It is in many ways, but we'll just look now what judgment means. Judgment, it tells us that a focused, sustained, substantiated judgment is reached. So firstly, it's specific to the concept in the question and is pursued throughout the essay. It's not Miss Marple who done it. We don't want to know at the end. It's not like a series of or multiple series of Line of Duty where you only find out after series 6 who actually H was. We want to know right at the beginning. And also judgment is a slightly more subjective, opinion-based. It's obviously based on the evidence that you've looked at throughout, but it's more than just evaluative statements. Say, you know, evaluative statements could be almost mini judgments, and a judgment is a bigger judgment. In terms of knowledge, what a 30 out of 30 mark essay would look like, according to the examiners, is that the learner is able to demonstrate, organise and communicate accurate knowledge, which shows clear understanding of the period studied. Well, this means that you use accurate and specific facts to back your debate up, and crucially not to lead your debate. The facts are backing up your argument, your debate, not letting them lead it, because if you let them lead it, it almost begins to look like a story, and that's not then analysing, evaluating, that's not judging. It might be showing knowledge, but it's not doing those other 2 things. And also, crucially, covers the whole of the set time period in the question as well. Doesn't cover part of it, doesn't cover elements outside of it. It covers just the set question, the time period in the set question. And lastly, it says in terms of communication for a top mark answer, the learner is able to communicate clearly and fluently using appropriate language and structure with a high degree of accuracy in a response which is coherent, lucid, concise and well constructed. Basically, in short, it reads very well. It includes wide vocabulary, accurate spelling, accurate grammar. Lucid is it reads really well, it flows freely, and that's what will happen if you're using wide vocabulary, if you've got your spelling and your grammar right as well. So according to examiners, that is what a 30 out of 30 mark essay would look like. Again, I've broken it down maybe a little bit clearer as to what each bit means, but again, you're always thinking, what does it actually mean in reality? What does an essay that gets that actually look like? Now, before we go any further, I just want to point you in the right direction, or point you in the direction of some Caroline Cymru hub playlists that I've made as well, specific to this unit, to Unit 1. And here you'll find some more general tips on how to write a good essay. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a good essay. On that, you'd find tips to kind of break down each step, and that playlist will be available from the 7th of February, I believe, on Caroline Cymru hub playlists. So the first task, when you get your question, in order to meet these things that the exam board is saying in their mark scheme, the first thing to do is to explode that question, right? You need to explode it to identify 3 key things. Firstly, the factor, the thing or things you need to talk about in your question. The second is the concept, the general idea that needs to be defined and debated throughout the entire essay. And the time period, the period of time you need to cover. Now, this may seem really obvious, but it is absolutely crucial to get in full marks, because if you don't cover the whole time period, you can't get full marks because you've not covered the whole time period, which is specific to the question. Equally, if you're talking about stuff from outside of the time period, it is a complete and utter waste of time because there's no marks in it. The examiners can't give you marks for talking about something that happened after the time period is finished because it's not in the specific question that you're being asked. So if we look at the 2022 Unit 1 Option 8 paper questions, we can have a look together now at what we mean about these factors, concepts and time periods. So if the question is, to what extent were international agreements the cause of tensions in Europe between 1894 and 1914, what we can say is that the factor is international agreements. International agreements are the things you're going to need to talk about. The concept is, to what extent did they cause tensions? So you might, in your first paragraph, you might talk about the Triple Entente as one international agreement. In the second paragraph, you might talk about the alliances that led to the Triple Alliance. Now, throughout all of that, you are discussing whether or not that caused tensions or not. And our time period then, 1894 to 1914. So if you're talking about stuff before 1894, or you're talking about stuff after 1914, say the League of Nations, right? Complete waste of time because it is after the time period in the question. Second question from the same paper, how effectively did Russian governments deal with the challenges it faced in the period from 1905 to 1945? Well, our factor is going to be challenges. Throughout your essay, you're going to talk about different challenges that the government might have faced. Challenge 1 might be the 1905 revolution. Challenge 2 might be the Bolshevik Rising. And throughout that whole essay, you're going to be talking about, to what extent did the government deal with that challenge? Were they effective in dealing with that challenge? So with each challenge you look at, you need to focus on how effectively they dealt with it. And again, time period 1905 to 1945, make sure you cover the whole of that time period. If you didn't cover the whole of that time period, then you're not going to get full marks. Next question then, was the Cold War was responsible for increased European cooperation in the period from 1945 to 1989? Discuss. 30 marks, as the same with the others as well. Our factor here would be the Cold War. So the Cold War is one thing that happened between 1945 and 1918 that may have increased European cooperation. Another one might be economic cooperation between European countries as well. So you'd be talking about the Cold War, talking about European economic cooperation. These are the things you're going to talk about in the essay. But the concept, the thing that needs to be debated throughout the essay, is whether or not that was actually responsible for increased cooperation or not. Did it create cooperation or did it not? Was it more responsible for creating cooperation than something else? And again, note the time period, 1945 to 1989. Now, the question we're going to look at today is this one. This came from that exam paper in 2022, and this essay that I'm going to show you was written for that exam paper and marked by examiners marking that exam paper. So the factor in this question would be fascist domestic policies. The concept would be change the lives of Italian people, and the time period is 1922 to 1943. So to what extent did fascist domestic policies change the lives of Italian people between 1922 and 1943? So the different things you're going to talk about throughout this essay are the fascist domestic policies. It might be the OMNI, it might be the ONB, it might be the OND, it might be the reform of customs, all of which are policies that happen within Italy. The concept, the thing you're going to be debating throughout, is to what extent did it change their lives? Did the OMNI change people's lives more or less than the OND? Did it change people's lives more or less than the reform of customs? And crucially, again, the time period 1922 to 1943. So what springs to mind here is if you began to talk about stuff in the Salo Republic that Mussolini formed in northern Italy from 1943 to 1945, you wouldn't get any credit for it at all because it's outside of the time period of the question. So as we go through this question now, this answer to this question now, I want you to be thinking, to what extent have they just talked about fascist domestic policies? If they're talking about international policies, foreign policies, then we know they're not relevant to the question at all. I want you to think about, to what extent have they focused, have they debated, have they defined that concept that it changes the lives of Italian people? Are they using the words of that question? Are they saying this changed the lives of Italian people because? And are we making sure that they are within that time period? Are they not using stuff from before and after? And are they actually covering the whole of that time period as well? So as we go through this question, those are the things to keep in mind, because those are the things that begin to form that more high mark question, which obviously you're looking to write. So this is the introduction of that question. This was, I'll reiterate again, this was an answer written in this exam for the 2022 exam paper, which I've had permission to use. So this is written in exam conditions, following revision, all of that. To a certain extent, fascist domestic policies changed the lives of Italian people between 1922 and 1943. Many policies in this time period were introduced to change each person's life significantly. Some of these included the OMNI, the OND, the ONB, fascist social policy for women, and the job creation scheme. So the first thing for me to note here in this introduction is, and we're going to focus on the good things first, and then later on we'll focus on how it could improve, is that what they've done is they've outlined the policies they're going to talk about, and every single one of them are absolutely bob on for our factor. They're absolutely bob on because they are all fascist domestic policies. None of them are foreign policies. So that means that it's going to be focused on the right factors, at least the right things. We're yet to see whether or not it's going to focus on that concept of the question. So the first paragraph, they decided to focus on one specific fascist domestic policy, the OND, the Opera Nazionale dopo lavoro. So they've said the Opera Nazionale dopo lavoro, introduced in the 1920s, changed the lives of the Italian people to a huge extent. It was an organisation for workers that provided leisure activities, holidays, entertainment and Sundays off for factory workers. The aim was to improve the lives of workers and their families through enjoyment rather than indoctrination. This domestic policy would have changed people's lives greatly because they could earn rewards for their hard work, meaning it is a positive change. However, you could say the extent of the change was limited, especially compared to an economic policy like the Battle of Lira in 1926, because this policy changed the lives of Italian people for the worse. Due to the revaluation of the lira, changing it was hard for Italians to exchange goods overseas, declining industry and creating job losses. Now, there's definitely some good things going on here. They have used the words of the question. Sorry, I thought I was underlining rather than highlighting there, but I'm highlighting instead. They've used the words of the question, change the lives of Italian people. Again, you can see here, improve the lives of workers and their families. Change the lives of the people greatly. They're offering an evaluation there. They're not just saying it changed their lives, but they're saying it changed their lives greatly. Another key thing is that in the first bit, they've given the positives, the argument for how it did change Italian lives a lot. In this second bit, following the word however, they began to give the argument against, how it begins to challenge the idea that it didn't necessarily change their lives that much. So that structure of the argument for, how it does change their lives, the argument against, picking holes in it, see maybe debating how it didn't change their lives, is something we'll keep an eye out for as we go through the future paragraphs as well. So this second paragraph begins to talk about the OMNI. So they start with this. On the other hand, domestic policies like the OMNI changed the lives of the people it affected to a significant extent. The OMNI helped pregnant women and their children from the mid-1920s onwards. The idea was to produce a healthy, growing population. This also ties in with the fascist social policy for women. Women were expected to stay at home and raise a healthy fascist youth who could continue fascism on for years. This was always expected of women, but with the help of the OMNI, the lives of women changed to a great extent. They had the support they needed to be able to carry out the duty they were expected to fulfill as a fascist woman in this period. As part of the OMNI, later on in the 1930s, other aspects were introduced, like pay for the sick. Although these policies changed the lives of Italian people, you could say it was only a limited extent. OMNI only looked at one aspect of women's lives, and it didn't help in many other areas other than maternity care, unlike the OND that focused on many parts of the lives of the Italians, including healthcare and welfare provisions to those who needed it. So I'm just going to stop for a second, and I'm going to let you think, where have they used the words of the question, or more importantly, the words of the concept of the question, changing the lives of Italian people? Where is there the break between the argument for and the argument against? So briefly, have a look at it, where they use the words of the question concept, and where is that break between argument for and argument against? So let's highlight some of those words where they've used the words of the question. So they have said the lives of women changed to a great extent. Again, they've offered some evaluation there, haven't they? They said to a great extent. They've also said that these policies changed the lives of Italian people, but to a limited extent. And that is it, isn't it? Right? But again, you've got the two evaluative statements there, to a great extent, to a limited extent. Now, you might be thinking in your head, well, that's contradictory, isn't it? On the one hand, they said to a great extent, to the other hand, they said to a limited extent. Well, that is not contradictory, that is analysis. In this beginning bit, they've got the argument for. In this second bit, they've got the argument against. As soon as they've used, I'm writing over the top of it now. As soon as they've used that word although, it signposts me, person marking it, the examiner, that they are looking at it from another point of view. And so that way you see that actually where they go from saying it changed to a great extent, changed to a limited extent, they're not contradicting each other, they're analysing. They're looking at it from more than one side. Now, another really good thing about this paragraph here is that it has also gone on to make a comparison to the first factor they discussed, the OND. And that's really, really good, because in order to make a judgment, as I said, remember your evaluation is like a mini judgment, your judgment is a big judgment. In order to make a big judgment, you need to compare between. Big judgments can't be done in isolation, unlike evaluative statements. So by comparing and linking the OMNI to the OND here, they are beginning to make an actual judgment. And that's really important, as you saw from that mark scheme. So our next paragraph. Additionally, the Opera Nazionale Balilla, the ONB, changed the lives of Italian people between 1922 and 1943. The ONB concerned extracurricular time for Italian children. Youth organisations were a way to influence the children outside of education and school in any spare time. This domestic policy would have changed the lives of the Italian people to a huge extent, because children would have constantly been under the influence of how Mussolini wanted the country to be run, even after he died. Not only would this domestic policy have changed children's lives significantly, but also the parents, especially since if the children weren't at school, they'd be doing activities away from home. So not only did this policy change each individual's life greatly, it would have also affected and changed many people's lives. However, it could be said that this domestic policy didn't change the lives of the Italian people to a huge extent because of some anti-fascist parents refused to send their children to such organisations meaning their lives wouldn't have really been affected in this period. So again, you've got your argument for, starting with additionally, your argument against, starting with however, analysing how the ONB did change people's lives, how it didn't, what limited its influence on changing people's lives. Again, a real positive here. It's another domestic policy, not a foreign policy. So it's bang on the factor as well. And then again, let's have a look where they use the words of that question. Don't forget, if you're watching this as a video, by the way, you can pause this as you go. Rather than trying to squeeze it in the short amount of time period I'm giving you, bear in mind I've got 45 minutes, you can pause it and you can then spend a little bit more time on it. So where they use the words of the concept of the question, remember that being changing the lives of Italian people, well, here we go again. Change the lives of Italian people to a huge extent. They've got an evaluation in there as well. Again, domestic policy changed people's lives significantly. Again, using the concept of the question, debating that concept throughout, now offering an evaluation as well. Again here. So you can see the factor, as I said, is domestic policies. So each paragraph is focusing on, as a centre, it's centering on a different domestic policy, but throughout the entire essay, they have to focus on that concept, which is the extent to which it changed the lives of the Italian people. Now, the one thing you'll note with this is there is no link, is there? There's no link here to the OMNI or the OMD. That's okay, that's no bother. They've done some very good, some other very good things at the same time. So again, another paragraph, right? On the one hand, you could say the job creation scheme started in 1922 changed the lives of the Italian people between 1922 and 1943. After the war, the homecoming of demilitarised soldiers meant thousands of men without jobs. The job creation scheme in 1922 was one of the first things Mussolini tackled when he came into power. The scheme would have changed the lives of the unemployed to a great extent because they were now being given a chance to work and make themselves some earnings. On the other hand, you could say the extent to which job creation schemes changed people's lives was limited because although it provided work, the pay may not have been spectacular. As well as this, many people were still left unemployed. Also, although work was being provided, other pressures of fascism, like unjustified celibacy and the harsh fascist social policies on women, still affect the Italian people, minimising the extent of domestic policy changing the lives of Italian people. So what's good about this paragraph? I'll just pause for a second as you just think what in particular is good about this paragraph based on what we've seen as good features before. So let's start with this element in particular, 1922. 1922 is the very beginning of our time period, so we are confident that they are covering our time period right from the very beginning. Job creation schemes started in 1922, so it's the beginning of the time period highlighted in the question, so it's a really good start. Our two phrases, on the one hand, on the other hand, jump out at us immediately that they're analysing. They're looking at it from more than one point of view. On the one hand, the argument for why it does change people's lives. On the other hand, the argument against what limits its impact on the change of people's lives. Again, referring to the concept in the question, changing people's lives. You've got change the lives of unemployed people to a great extent. Change their lives to a limited extent. Now, there is here also some comparison. This bottom bit here, there's some comparison. Now, what's interesting about that is the social policies on women is a factor we've looked at, or they've looked at in their essay previously, the OMNI. But they're also talking about things like unjustified celibacy, a policy they've not talked about yet, which is something maybe we'll look at again when we come to think about how could this essay be improved. So last but by no means least, the conclusion. In conclusion, fascist domestic policies changed the lives of the Italian people to a huge extent between 1922 and 1943. The OMNI, OND, ONB, fascist social policy on women and job creation schemes all changed the lives of each individual in some way, which was usually significant to each person. So they've restated the policies they're looking at. They've restated the time period that they're looking at. and they have focused to some extent on that concept of changing the lives of the Italian people. So to some extent, the conclusion has got some creditworthiness in it. Now, this was not given 30 marks out of 30. This wasn't given 26 marks out of 30, so this isn't a band 6 answer at all. This was given 20 marks out of 30. Now, what that would mean is if you trace back the grade boundaries throughout previous years, which you can do online or ask your teacher to do, that would mean it would be, in the exam, it would have been a high B. So there's no two ways about it. It is a good essay because a B is a good grade, but it's not an A or an A star essay. So what makes it good, just to remind you to kind of refocus in, what made it good was they had good use of the question words, particularly that concept, throughout the entire essay. Throughout the entire essay, they focused on the concept of, to the extent it changed the lives of Italian people. It had some good factors, all of which were domestic policies, so it wasn't drifting into foreign policies and things like that. And also with their clear paragraph structure that started with an argument for and then went to an argument against. I don't know why it's missing out part of my letters. By breaking it down like that, there is some clear analysis going on in their answer. I've just realised I've totally given the game away, haven't I? Where I said it was 20 marks. I was going to ask you which band and what mark, but we can say it was band 4. Now remember what I said about the examiners, they choose the band first and then they choose the mark after. So the examiners would have read all these bands and they decided that it was band 4. So they're saying the learner is able to show understanding the key issue, demonstrating sound analysis and evaluation. So they definitely show understanding because they focus on domestic policies throughout. Sound analysis, because at each one they broke it down, why it did change people's lives, why it didn't change people's lives, or what limited the change on people's lives. Evaluation, because it said it greatly changed people's lives. It limited the change on people's lives. Judgment, a judgment is seen, but lacks some support or substantiation. I would agree fully with that. It's definitely seen because they're making some comparison between them. It is suggesting which ones had big impact, but it does definitely lack some support or substantiation, particularly in that conclusion, which we'll come back and look at again in a second. Evidence of accurate deployment of knowledge, for sure. There's definitely some key knowledge demonstrated there. Good level of written communication and a reasonable degree of accuracy. Absolutely, it flowed quite nicely when I was reading it, I felt, and that's a key thing when it comes to communication, isn't it? So what the examiners did, they decided it's band 4. They decided it's not band 5. It doesn't show good, what does it say? It doesn't clearly analyse, it just shows sound analysis. It's not that it's substantiated judgment, it lacks some substantiation. And then they decide, well, is it a high band 4, is it a low band 4? In this case, they decided a high band 4, so therefore it's going to be 20 marks. So how could this essay get here? How could it look at each factor from more than one angle, make clear and evidenced objective statements, specific to a concept, pursuing it throughout the essay, more subjective opinion, offering, a judgment as that more subjective opinion, displaying accurate specific fact, covering the whole time period, reading well. Well, let's re-look at it again and let's see at what points they could have done what to improve this essay. So again, just a reminder of the question: to what extent did fascist domestic policies change the lives of Italian people between 1922 and 1943? So the things you're going to discuss throughout are fascist domestic policies. The concept is to what extent did it change people's lives in the time period 1922 to 1943. So what we're really looking for in order to improve is where is it drifted from those, or where is it not quite met those, because they're the key to improving that answer. So let's start with the introduction, and there's a really simple thing that can be done in the introduction to really improve the judgment in particular. So the introduction said, to a certain extent, fascist domestic policies changed the lives of Italian people between 1922 and 1943. Many policies in this time period were introduced to change each person's life significantly. Some of these include the OMNI, the OND, the ONB, fascist social policy for women, and job creation schemes. So they've clearly outlined the fascist domestic policies they're going to talk about, but they haven't offered a judgment at this beginning point. They haven't defined what they're going to argue as the change in lives of Italian people will be judged upon. So what they really need to do here is they need to set out which one changed lives most. Right, I don't know why it keeps doing this, sorry. Right, so that might be the OND or the OMB, and why. So if I was writing this essay, based on what they've said, is I would say, in my introduction, I would be saying that the OND changed the lives of Italian people most because of the positive impact it had on people, and so the greater the support for the fascist regime. So what I've done there is I've offered my judgment right from the beginning. As I said, it's not an episode or a series of Line of Duty where 6 series in, right, you finally find out who H is. It's right at the beginning. I want to know who it is or what it is that you think changed the lives of Italian people most, because that way you can sustain your judgment. Keyword using that mark scheme, sustain your judgment. And I want the why. The why is really important here because it means you're defining what you're going to make your judgment based against. So I've said what it means to change the lives of Italian people is to have a positive effect on them. So my kind of evaluation, my judgment is going to be based on to what extent did it make a positive impact on those Italian people's lives. It gives me a more clear judgment evaluation tool to pursue throughout that essay. So what's good, as we saw before, focuses on domestic policies. There's no foreign policies there. That's really good. It tries to suggest we're going to keep them within that time period. That's really good, but it doesn't give me that judgment from the beginning, which can then allow us sustained judgment throughout the entire essay. So the main body was made up of, I seem to remember, 4 main paragraphs, right? As we said, structured well. We can see this in this paragraph here, right? The change the lives of Italian people. And then halfway through, we had the however. So we've got our clear analysis. But what I would say here in particular is that there isn't quite enough detail. There isn't quite enough specific detail. So what I'm talking about here is where they're talking about the impact that the OND had in terms of providing leisure activities. They could have thrown the key fact in here that by about 1938, every town in Italy had an OND funded football club. Now that shows the extent to which it impacted the entirety of Italy, doesn't it? It's a key specific fact that can show that. In this paragraph as well, what you can see is they've gone on to talk about the battle for Lira. Now it is a domestic policy, credit where credit's due. It's definitely a domestic policy, and so we can't argue with that. But to try and link the OND to the battle for Lira at this point means there isn't quite enough depth, because the battle for Lira isn't a policy that they've already looked at. So in this first paragraph, almost you don't want any links in this first paragraph because you've got nothing to link it to. You haven't discussed any other factors at this point. So what I'd like to see in this, however, is more specifics that suggested the limited impact of the of the OND on Italian people. More specific factors to show that, rather than the link in this first bit. This second paragraph, again, we said it's got some good bits. It's got on the one hand, and on this case, it had the although, didn't it? The 2 sides. Again, it's got good use of the words of the question, change the lives to a significant extent, etc. But again, for me, it doesn't quite have enough specific facts. OMNI helped pregnant women and their children from mid-1920 onwards. The idea was to produce a healthy, growing population. Also ties in with fascist social policy for women. Women are expected to stay at home, raise healthy fascist youth who can continue fascism on for years. This was always expected of women, but with the help of the OMNI, the lives of women changed to a great extent. Support through offering support through things like sick pay. On the other hand, policies changed the lives of Italian people. You could say it was only to a limited extent. OMI only looked at one aspect of women's lives and it didn't help in many other areas, maternity care. Unlike the OND, that focused on many parts of the lives of Italian, including healthcare and welfare provision to those who needed it. Particularly in this argument against here, for me, it lacks specific details. It lacks that real specific detail that shows the examiner that this person knows the ins and outs of the topic that they've been studying. They really sat in every lesson and listened. They've really worked hard in terms of building up their knowledge. So an example of something I'd be using here is that actually by 1945, the Italian birth rate had dropped dramatically since 1922. And in fact, if I could remember it after long hard revision, I'd probably have that specific fact of what the drop in the birth rate would be as well. That'd be a specific detail that would really exemplify the idea that this person has talked about in their essay. The idea is great, the structure is great, the reference to the concept in the question is great, but they need that specific detail. So right at the beginning, if you remember that mark scheme, I said the details don't lead the debate, the details support the debate. They've got that idea here. They've got the idea that the debate is what they're doing and the details support it. They haven't quite got enough detail at the moment to support it. And on this paragraph here, going forward and going back, another thing on this paragraph here that would be really good would be to see them then make some sort of comparison to the OND. Did the OMI change lives more? I'm just thinking what I want to do is not that one. It's the wrong paragraph. I apologize profusely. The next paragraph, I'll make that same point. So on this one, again, same thing. Additionally, and there was a however in this one, wasn't it? However, they've got change the lives of the Italian people. They've got these key things, change the lives, etc. Change many people's lives, change their lives to a huge extent. They've got the focus on the concept. It is domestic policy. Again, my same criticism is going to be that they don't have enough specific facts, particularly in that argument against, particularly in this argument against here, there isn't enough specific facts. Now, what I'd also really like to see, and what an examiner would like to see for a 30 out of 30 mark essay, is a comparison here to the OND and the OMNI as well. So did the ONB change people's lives more than the OND or more than the OMNI? It said here that fascist parents refusing to send their children to the ONB might limit its impact. So they might say here, the OND and people's refusal to attend the OND also shares that idea and so limits the impact the OND had as well. That link between the two paragraphs shows more than just evaluation of to a significant extent, to a huge extent. It then begins to make it a judgment. That comparison between the factors makes it a judgment. This last paragraph, or last main paragraph, again, on the one hand, on the other hand, it's got the changing the lives of Italian people, the use of limited use of the question. But again, it's not got the comparison that it could have. The comparison that it could have to your argument, for your argument against here, could see links to the ONB, the OND, the OMNI. Again, what about the job creation schemes means it changed people's lives more than these other factors? Or what about it means it changed their lives less than these other factors? When you're directly making that comparison, you are making a judgment rather than just an evaluation. And this point really is hammered home with this conclusion here. This conclusion, for me, and no doubt for the examiner, hence why it's 20 marks rather than 30 marks, this conclusion is not offering a clear enough judgment. If you read that introduction there, sorry, that conclusion there, you wouldn't think that that conclusion answers the question. You wouldn't think that they've got an opinion on what it's asking. You can't see in that conclusion there where they're saying which one of these policies had the biggest impact on Italian people's, change Italian people's lives. So what you need in that conclusion is, as I've said, when it comes to the paragraphs, links. in this paragraph, if in the conclusion, if nothing else, if you don't make links throughout, so I've suggested in the previous paragraph, make a link to the OM&I, the OND, how did it mean job creation schemes change people's lives more or less than the OM&I or the OND? If you're not going to do that throughout the essay, then at a minimum, you need to make those links in the conclusion. You need to make that comparison in the conclusion. It also needs a very, very clear judgment as part of it. Now, to be honest, the moment you start to link, the moment you begin to make a judgment. Because if you start to link the OM&I and the OND, you can't help but say the OND had a bigger impact, it changed people's lives more. Or you can't help but say the ONB changed people's lives more. And that's you making a judgment. So where in the marks scheme it talks about sustained judgment throughout, but we didn't have that in introduction and we don't have that in the conclusion. So that is really where it lets itself down. It's really where it means it doesn't get those higher marks. Now, there's no two ways about it. As I said, it is a good essay. 20 out of 30 marks, looking at those grade boundaries, is a high B. You cannot turn your nose up at that at all. That is very, very good. But it is not 30 out of 30 marks, which is ultimately what everyone wants to be writing, isn't it? Everyone wants to write a 30 out of 30 mark essay because that means it's an A grade answer all day long and happy days, frankly, right? So the one last thing, and I'll go back, apologies for this, one last thing I want to say about this is in terms of your introduction. With your introduction, what you can do in your head in order to make it a little bit easier is you can refer to it as what I always refer to in class as an answer in a nutshell. Now imagine a nutshell, it's very, very small, isn't it, right? It's very, very small. It's not an answer in a watermelon, right, which would be big. It's very, very small. Now, what that means is you're setting out your judgment from the beginning. And the best way to think about this is if this was a 3-mark question, not a 30-mark question, how would you answer it? As a 3-mark question, I'd be answering this by saying the OND had the biggest impact in changing the lives of Italian people because of the positive impacts it had on people, such as the provision of relaxation opportunities for Italian people. That'd be a really good 3-mark answer. So your introduction is like a 3-mark answer to that question. Your essay as a whole is a 30-mark answer to that question. If you do it like that, then you'll get into the idea of your introduction, sets out your argument, defines what you're going to evaluate against. In this case, changing the lives of Italian people is having a positive impact. And then throughout the essay, you can follow that argument. You can sustain that analysis, that evaluation, and that judgment, because you've already set it out in your answer in a nutshell, in your 3-mark answer to that question. So I hope that that has provided a little bit of clarity for you on what makes a good essay. Feel free, as Karen said at the beginning, feel free to look at the Caroline Cymru website, rewatch it, stop it at key points, look at the essay, identify, as I said, as we're going on, identify what makes it good, what limits its good. Go through, even have a go at answering this essay question yourself by implementing the suggestions that I've made as how to improve it as well. Give it to your teacher, your lecturer, they can mark it, give it back to you and see what you've got. When you get that structure, when you get those patterns right, you can then apply it to other questions, like the questions we looked at earlier on from the 2022 exam paper, by identifying the factor, the concept, the time periods, and then running with it, having a go. Again, giving it back to your teacher, your lecturer to mark it, see how you're getting on. So that brings me to the end of my review of a good Italy essay. Thank you very much for sitting there this evening and listening, and particularly to my mistakes as I annotated the wrong thing on the wrong slide at one point, things like that. But thank you very much. The next couple of weeks then, Karen is going to look at Unit 2. So starting with question 1, source skills, and then going on to look at interpretation skills as well. So please join us for that. Learn some skills that are going to help you with your exams, with your preparation for the exams as we go in the next few months in the build up to the exam, which will no doubt be in May or June.